Good morning. It's going to be tough to follow Paul, so you have to accommodate me. And I became a researcher for a reason because I am shy and I'm socially clumsy. So to follow Paul is a very tough thing to do. Luckily, I have also my colleague here, David Strausser, and I will both talk about how to use some of the big data that the federal government collected that we can use to detect patterns of things that may be interesting for us. So today, we're actually going to talk about big data analytics and also how we can use big data analytics to analyze big government data also, okay? So Dave, you want to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Colin. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dave Strausser. I'm at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and as was said by Paul, I'm an alumni here, and it's always good to come home to Wisconsin. Of course, this building has changed a lot since I've had class in here. You know, the stairs are more stable. The rooms look a lot more modern, obviously, versus when I was here, and it was a beautiful building on the mall, but not as up to date as now. So, pleasure to be here.
So basically, I will start, and then Dave will close up the presentation, okay? So basically, my part will be to look at big data analytics and what are some of the statistical modeling we've been using to kind of extract interesting information from the RSA 911 data. And I'm going to go through some of the basic elements in the RSA 911 data and how we can use additional government data to help us find interesting things out of that data set. As you know, we are into this millennium world that I am not familiar with, but you guys are, because when I first start teaching, I will be looking at students in the back actually reading newspaper. And now when I look to the back, students are actually all looking at their iPhone because I'm so boring anyway. So, but the time has changed, okay? And so if you look at big data analytics in this interconnected electrical world, you can see there's social media, there's web, there's all kinds of things that generate a lot of data. It can be numerical data, it can be video streaming data, etc., etc. And also within our field, when you look at the Affordable Care Act, they were banking on that if we can analyze advanced health communication technology data that can be used hopefully to improve healthcare outcomes. And for us, we also have a lot of rehabilitation data that's huge, and we probably can also use the same technology that business use to extract data, to look at pattern recognition type result, and use that to improve business outcomes. I think we can also use the same technology to hopefully detect patterns that we can use to improve employment outcomes for people with disabilities. So what do they do with this kind of data? Basically, they use it to look at data warehouse and look at aggregation of data, and they can indexing, searching, and queuing of those data. And also they can use knowledge discovering by using data mining, statistical modeling to look at things. So if you look at the traditional way of doing data analysis, descriptive, diagnostic, they are also using it to look at causal relationship, et cetera, and they do experiment to look at cause-effect analysis. But when you use data mining, basically you're looking at relationship, but you use pattern recognition to find out things that may be similar to cause effect, but it's basically using correlational data, using pattern recognition. So So I just want to actually share with you, say, what do business use big data to analyze things. So one year in 2002, I took a sabbatical from here and I went to Columbia College in Chicago to go to film school to learn how to make film, to be a director, and to be a screenwriter. And so one of my projects, when I was thinking about writing a script about a skinhead who actually roaming around Chicago and looking for targets and things like that. And I don't know enough about skinhead. So I went to Amazon.com and start looking at all those skinhead, all those gun violence type books, right? So I start buying enough all those extreme conservative gun-holding type books. What happened? Well, Amazon.com will be every time when I log on to Amazon.com, they think I love gun and they thought I am a white extremist or something like that, right? Well, they are doing basically data mining to match me with my interests, okay? And so for a long time, I think Amazon thinks that I am this extreme gun-loving person, but actually I'm only buying those things for my screenwriting. Okay, so it took me a while to get rid of that because then I have a niece who was born and I loved my niece, and so a few years later I started buying children's book. Okay, and so over time then Amazon.com think that I'm this guy who loves children, right? So with the green ham and egg and things like that. Okay, so they try to match you and they try to then match you with your interests. Okay, so in rehabilitation we have multiple big data set. For example, you guys are all stable rehab counselors, and you hated to fill out that RSA 911 form, right? And that RSA 911 form then get uploaded to Rehab Services Administration as a national data set, and then that national data set become available to us as researchers after they strip off the personal identifiers. And the RSA data, they close about 500,000 cases per year collectively out of the 80 agencies. And so you can do interesting things with the data, but the data is somewhat shallow. So many researchers then try to add additional national data set to play with it, okay? So today we're gonna show you a few things that we have been doing, but it may be actually interesting to rehab counselors because we find some interesting thing that may help you to think about some of the way that you do things when you do your practice, okay? So that's the RSA 911 data set that a lot of researchers use, and sometimes they use it in a very simple way, basically more descriptive, but the data set actually contain very interesting information. The only thing that I'm complaining about is like there's certain variables are not in there. For example, they never collect data on marital status, and I like to have that because it can be a proxy for social support. They don't have data on their previous work history, and actually previous work history is actually a good predictor of employment outcomes. So the data set have some limitations. Okay, and so I'm going to run it through real quickly, and you can see that we can look at all kinds of things. They have gender, they have race, ethnicity, they have age, they have education, they have whether you receive Social Security or not, etc., etc. They also have the information about your disability type, and of course, they have information about your closer information, your weekly earning, how many hours do you work, do you have employer-based health insurance when we close you, how much it costs to help you become rehabilitated, and also how long it takes, and what's the average case expenditure, etc., etc. So that's basically the RSA 911 data set, okay? And of course, they also have code for your major disability categories, can be sensory, physical, and also cognitive disabilities. And they also have specific cause for disability. So you can also extract people with, say, spinal cord injury, learning disability, ASD, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So, and then they also have the 24 services. So like assessment, diagnostic, college or university training, vocational training, on-the-job training, job placement, on-the-job support, support employment, et cetera, et cetera. So we know a lot about the cases are being closed by you guys, and also, so we can, if we want to drill it down to Wisconsin, we can, but most of the researchers tend to basically analyze the data in aggregate as a national data. And so for professors like us, usually we have nothing to do most of the time. And so every year we ask for the RSA 911 data, and then worse yet, we don't even do it ourselves. So we happen to see a doctoral student, we just pull them into our office and say, hey, I have this great idea, why don't you do it? So of course the students are smart enough to not walk past my office anyway. So, so then I have to go look for them, and okay, now no one's going to be in their office because they don't want to be looked for, okay? So eventually I have to do a few things myself, okay? But anyway, so we've been using interesting statistical modeling with the RSA 911 data. Most people traditionally basically only looking at whether they go to work or not work, and what are some of the factors that predict whether they go to work and not work, and they use something called logistic regression. But after you did that, say, I've been a professor for 33 years, so after you do that 10 times, you're just like, wow, it's so boring, I gotta find something different to do, okay? So actually we, nowadays we use different thing, more modern thing. We learn it from the business, we use data mining type thing to look at stuff, okay? And so what is data mining? Data mining basically is defined as, can we use big data set? Can we use something interesting to extract hidden predictive information from large data sets, okay? So remember, an annual RSA 911 data set has about 500,000 records. So that's actually pretty big, okay? And they close about 300,000 people in either 26 or 28, okay? So it's still a relatively big data set. Okay, and so now this is my new Amazon homepage that people tend to look at green ham and egg and things like that. I cleanse myself from my gun book buying days. Okay, so now I feel better because I don't want the FBI to be knocking on my door. We actually have one of our doctoral students who about to graduate, and she's an FBI agent in Seattle. So if anything happens, I can ask her for help. So I've been pretty nice to her. So, but anyway, so data mining has been used a lot by business and marketing research. So in one way you can look at it will be, business basically want to do market segmentation. They want to find homogeneous subgroup with certain characteristics that they know they have certain consumer purchasing behavior, right? So business is really interested basically in doing market segmentation, okay? But in rehabilitation, we can do the same thing. We can find homogeneous subgroups that may be better off with certain services, and then with those certain services, would they get better outcome, right? So data mining is actually a good way to help us also do market segmentation or disability group segmentation, that we can make them homogeneous and then relate them back to certain specific services that are customized to them. And hopefully those customized services will lead to better rehabilitation outcome, okay? So, one year, Paul and I have nothing to do. Actually, Paul is more hardworking than I am, but I have nothing to do, okay? So Paul talked to me and say, hey, you know, Bob Dre and Gary Barn has been doing quick randomized control trial to demonstrate that IPS, a form of support employment, is very useful to improve employment outcomes of people with schizophrenia, right? But remember, Paul is actually the one who's you can say he's the founder of supported employment, right? But Gary Barn and Bob Drake was well known for actually validating supported employment using randomized control trial, okay? And since Paul and I are relatively old, right? So we're over 60, so we are not going to go to the field and do randomized control trial, okay? So we basically say, can we do something just with the RSA 911 data? And can we do something similar to randomized control trial, but not quite, right? So, so I talked to Paul about the recent development in what we call propensity score matching in public health. And basically we are sort of doing randomized control trial. We are thinking about, can we pick up a group, say for example, a group of people who receive supported employment and match them with appropriate group that are similar in demographic characteristics, but they did not receive supported employment, okay? And then we want to see what happened if those similar homogeneous group, that within those group, if they receive supported employment, do they do better than people who did not receive supported employment in state agencies? And we can do that in with the RSA 911 data by doing 2 steps. So the first step will be we use data mining to predict who would receive supported employment. Now the assumption will be, you know, all the counselors are appropriately trained, okay? Most of them have a master's degree in rehab counseling, and they have been working in the field for a long, long time. So they basically, when they have a consumer coming to them, when they provide a pattern of services for them, we can probably basically assume that they probably know what they're doing, okay? So I'm sure you guys know what you're doing. But anyway, so that's our assumption, okay? So basically then we would use appropriate demographics to then predict who would be most likely to receive supported employment when they go to stable rehab agencies. So how likely they receive supported employment services is what we call a propensity, okay? So if for certain characteristics, that 80% of that characteristics group will receive supported employment, then we will say they have 80% propensity to receive supported employment, okay? So by using a 2-step analysis, one will be to predict who will receive supported employment, okay? And what kind of characteristics will then predict they will receive supported employment, okay? Then, but within that group, there will be some people who did not receive supported employment. Then we want to compare, will be if the group that receives supported employment, what's the employment outcome? And then the group that did not receive supported employment, what's the outcome, okay? So we published this paper in Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, which is a relatively good journal. And of course, Paul is the lead researcher for that. And I am basically a technician, so I basically help with the data analysis. Okay. So basically what we want to do will be to examine the effect of supported employment intervention on the employment outcomes of transition age youth with ID and DD. Okay, and basically the question is simple: is supported employment an effective intervention for enhancing work rehab outcome for transition age youth? And what are the characteristics of those youth with IDD who benefit most from the supported employment interventions? Okay, and so basically we use propensity score matching, but using a observational data, which is the RSA 911 data. The first dependent variable will be to predict who will receive supported employment. The second dependent variable will be then out of those subgroups, those who receive SE, what's the outcome, what's the employment outcomes, okay? Okay. So again, we use the RSA 911 data, fiscal year 2009, because we did the study a couple years ago. Okay. And so those are basically the group that you use are primary people who are appropriate for supported employment, including intellectual disabilities, autism, cerebral palsy, and TBI. And so basically, the goal will be to identify a subset of people with disabilities who are most appropriate to receive supported employment, who has the highest propensity score to receive supported employment. So using data mining, the first things that we want to do will be to predict who has the highest propensity to receive support employment. So as you can see if I can, what do I do? Okay, where's my pointer? This one? Yeah. Okay, so as you can see, in general, if you go to stable rehab agencies, there are about 36% chance for these 4 disability groups to receive support employment. So you guys may not know consciously or unconsciously, but in general, the national data indicated that if you have ID, DD, you basically, in general, the rehab counselors will provide, there's a 34% propensity to receive support employment. Now, we can then look at what other variables will make them have a higher propensity or lower propensity to receive support employment. You can see the computer using data mining find a pattern. So although we use a lot of predictors, but the computer will only choose the most potent predictors. So you can see the computer is saying that if you receive special education, the rehab counselors automatically will be more likely to give you supported employment. So you go from 36% all of a sudden that your propensity to receive supported employment goes up to 55% if you have received special education when you are in high school. Okay? Now then the computer find another predictor variable will be if you also receive SSI or SSDI, the counselors, for some reason, will increase the propensity to provide supported employment for you to 62%. If you receive special education, but you did not receive SSI or SSDI, there are a 44% propensity to receive supported employment. Now, if you did not receive special education and you receive regular education, or you're a high school dropout, or you have post-secondary education and application, and you did not receive any benefit, you only have 24% propensity for that 4 disability group to receive support employment. But if you receive SSI, that propensity also increase again, that you will have 39% propensity. And if you have cerebral palsy, it goes down to 24%. But if you have intellectual disability or autism, and you have a high school degree, that's 54% chance that you will receive supported employment, but you have less than high school education or a post-secondary education, your chance of receiving support employment goes down. Okay? So basically, you can see certain characteristics, for some reason, will prime the rehab counselors to either think about giving them support employment or not giving them support employment. Okay? So the group that has the highest propensity to receive supported employment will be you receive special education and you receive SSI, SSDI. The counselors, for some reason, when they see those groups, they tend to give them or consider giving them support employment. Okay? And so those are some of the propensity to receive support employment. You can see if they have, if they are ID or autism, they have high propensity to receive SE. And if they have special education, they have a higher propensity to receive support employment. So basically, the group that has the highest propensity, remember the group that has 60% chance to receive support employment is the group that receives special education and also receiving SSI or SSDI benefits. So basically, that group has a higher chance of, let's see, so this group has a, the description of this group will be 85% intellectual disabilities, 61% male, average age is about 21 years old, propensity score to receive 62%. And let's take a look at the data for this group. So you can see, so they have 62% chance of receiving supported employment, but within this group, if they receive supported employment, 58% will be closed as successfully, have a successful employment outcome. But in this group, if they do not receive support employment, only 37% will have a successful employment outcome. So the difference is 21%. So in this group with these characteristics, if you give them supported employment, there's a 21% difference in successful employment outcome. So that's pretty high, okay? And so we can keep on looking at groups that with high propensity to receive support employment. The second group will be the group that also receives special education, but they did not have SSI or SSDI benefits. For this group, again, if you receive support employment, you have 63% success rate, and if you don't receive support employment, you have 43% success rate. The difference also 20%, okay? So you can see will be for every group, even if they have low propensity to receive support employment, if you give them support employment, there's actually a differential employment outcomes. So given the sample size is different, okay, so we weighted the sample size and then we add the employment outcomes together. So within this 4 disability group, if they receive supported employment, regardless propensity to receive supported employment, the weighted average is about 12% difference. So when you look at employment outcomes, a 12% employment differences is actually pretty high. So basically we demonstrated without doing a experimental design using a case control study, we basically demonstrated that if for these disability groups, especially for people with intellectual disability or ASD, if they receive supported employment, they actually have a significantly higher probability of a successful employment outcome. So that's basically what we found using a RSA 911 data without actually going to collect data, but using the national data set, using data mining approach. So that's one way that we can use the RSA 911 data to begin to look at things for you. So if you look at, say, the WIOA also said that stable rehab agencies have to put more emphasis on post-secondary education intervention. So we could use the RSA 911 data and say, what happened if we give certain groups post-secondary education intervention? Is the return on investments good enough? Do they actually get better outcome, or do they make more money after we close? Do they have higher quality employment outcomes? But the second study is actually interesting, so I want to share with you the second study first. So again, professors have nothing to do, okay? And people working for a foundation has nothing to do also. So, John O'Neill at Kessler Foundation actually has a research and training center on individual characteristics. And his focus is on SSI, SSDI recipients. And there's really because you cannot do randomized controlled trial to look at the overall effect of stable rehab interventions, okay? We can look at some of the specific interventions within the stable rehab agencies, but no one can say, can we look at the overall effect of stable rehab as an intervention? Because we cannot do randomized controlled trial and ask consumers who come to your office and say, for the sake of science, can I make you wait another year before I give you services? You cannot do that, okay? So basically, again, we have to use huge data set in order to say, can we try to look at the overall effect of stable rehab as a intervention? There's no study like that. So this is the first study that we want to look at. What's the overall effect of stable rehab? Okay, if you come to stable rehab, what happened to you? You do have a higher chance of get out of SSI or SSDI, basically. Okay, so in this study, we have to use two data sets. The first data set will be we pick up a few years of the RSA 911 data, okay? Then we have to go to Social Security Administration, which has a much richer data set on the people's demographic information, and also knowing that do they get out, do they go to TWP, the trial work period, or do they actually terminate their SSI benefits or their SSDI benefits because they managed to find a job, okay? So we have to link two data sets together, the RSA 911 data set, and then we link actually what happened in the Social Security Administration data set. So that's actually very unique, and it requires a lot of memorandum of working agreement between RSA and Social Security Administration, and I am not allowed to go look at that data because it had personal identifiers and all those kind of things. So as a researcher, we can only then ask Mathematica what kind of analysis we want to do, because they own that data set in some kind of secret places, and their computers locked into one room, and you have to use 6 passwords to get in and things like that, okay? Because it's really a confidential data set, basically, okay? So therefore, you can see that we basically use the, do I have to, yeah. So we have to use the disability analysis file, 2010. It's also known as the ticket service file. And then we use the RSA 911 data, okay? And then basically from the RSA 911 data, we match the people who are receiving SSI, SSDI from the DAF file, and then we join our population from there. So how do we do the matching? So once we have the data, okay, and we want to look at people, so the economists call people between 25 and 54 prime working age. The reason we choose this will be, if you're at prime working age, you're supposed to be working. Okay, and so that's actually better to use this data set than say younger, because younger you may be in college and things like that. So if I use prime working age, and I'm over the prime working age, so I'm supposed to be retiring, okay? But I listened to Mike Leahy 2 years ago, and Mike said, I will never retire, all right, Mike, okay? And so I'm following him now and say, I'm never gonna retire. Don't let my dean know, because I'm getting expensive, so he's trying to talk me into retiring, okay? But anyway, I'm just kidding, okay? But anyway, so we take the prime working age, okay, from who receiving DI, SSDI in 2000, okay? And we also look at people who did not, within that group, those people who actually never received stable rehab services. And then we look at also a group of people who are SSDI recipients, but actually received stable rehab services. So from this group, we want to then match using certain demographic characteristics to find matching group that did not receive stable rehab services. But we want them to be almost identical in characteristics. So the only thing different is, since they're identical in their characteristics, the only difference is one group receives stable rehab services and one group did not receive stable rehab services. Then we want to follow them, because it's a longitudinal data, that later on we want to see which group will have a higher trial work period outcome, or termination from benefits because they have a job, okay? And so we then use that to break it to, okay, one group that go to stable rehab application before they qualify for DI. One group will be receiving stable rehab services less than 1 year after they receive DI. One group that's receive stable rehab services between 1 to 2 years after they receive DI, 2 to 3 years after they receive DI, 3 to 4 years after they receive DI, 4 to 5 years after they receive DI, okay? So that's actually the subgroups. So using propensity score matching, this time using logistic regression, when we try to look at the group that receive stable rehab services and the group that did not receive stable rehab services, actually the two groups have somewhat different demographic characteristics. And so you can see they differ in all kinds of things in the demographic characteristics. But then we try to match the stable rehab applicants based on all these demographic characteristics. So after we match them with the demographic characteristics, you can see the two groups that are matched are basically now matched. with only a couple things that are still problematic, but most of the demographic characteristics are now very similar. So we managed to find two groups with identical demographic characteristics. So the only thing left that we think can be whether they receive stable career interventions or not stable career interventions. So then we use logistic regression to compare those 6 groups that are being matched, okay? The only difference will be whether one group received work rehab services, one group that did not, okay? So since I'm not Paul, I don't have a video to show you, but at least I have a graphic, okay? So you can see that will be, for the group that receive stable career services, they actually have much higher rate over the 10-year period, higher rate of trial work period, okay, compared to the matching group, okay? And you can see for those that before they receive the DI, they receive stable career services, less than 1 year, you can see the difference, and 1 to 2 years, and also 2 to 3 years. So then this is the 3 to 4 years, and this is the 4 to 5 years. So you can see if you receive stable career services, surprisingly, actually, they do better than the people who are matched but did not receive stable career services along all those subgroups, okay? So if people ask you whether stable career services is effective in actually or make a difference for SSDI recipients who are in their prime working age, this is one of the studies that actually demonstrate receiving stable career services actually help, okay? And then again, I have nothing to do 1 year, so we want to also look at using the RSA 911 data along with external variables data, like would the state unemployment rate influence your good work, right? So we may want to know whether, say, if I work in a poor state, what happened? So if I stay with a very low per capita income, what happened? If I stay with a high unemployment rate, what happened? Would that affect my ability to place people with disabilities? If I work in a state that has a smaller caseload, what happened? If I work in a state that have certain kind of administration type policy that they're supposed to help, what happened? So we want to link those environmental factors with your services and also individual characteristics. So that's another way that we can try to milk or extract more information from the RSA 911 data, okay? And actually, of course, I will not be doing anything, you know that. So you can see the authors are all my doctoral students. Jia-Chang Wang is now assistant professor at University of Buffalo. Sandra is an assistant professor now at San Francisco State. And Veronica is at Hunter College. And Nicole Ditchman is at Illinois Institute of Technology. But they did this study with me when they were doctoral students. And they were kicking and screaming and don't want to do it. But now as a professor, every time when we go to the NCRE conference, they all feel that they owe me a drink, and I feel obligated to drink it. And so I'm not an alcoholic, but I just feel obligated to receive their kindness. And so when you see me not cohesive, not coherent, will be because of my kindness, politeness. I'm not a drunk, okay? But anyway, so we use the RSA 911 data, but then we also go to the Department of Labor and extract unemployment rate for 3 fiscal years. And we also extract unemployment for every state, and also per capita income in every state, and also the percentage of urban communities for every state, okay? And then we pick up information from the RSA website on state agency characteristics. And so we match those things together using something called multi-level analysis to look at person-environment interaction that may affect then employment outcomes of people with disabilities. Now, it's important will be what if the environment indeed influence employment outcomes, then it may affect your own performance, because the environment may have something to do with outcomes. So we were interested in actually 3 years. Remember the Great Recession? I cannot believe the Great Recession so many years ago. It seems like yesterday, because my salary has not been increased for 10 years, okay? But the Great Recession started in late 2007. And it became very severe in 2008, and according to the Department of Labor, that it officially ended in the middle of 2009, but I'm sure that we are still suffering from that consequence, right? Luckily, I have no children, so I don't care, okay? But you guys have, okay? So, but anyway, so we picked those 3 years because of that. And initially, we want to study actually whether environmental factors influence employment outcomes. But actually interesting, when we try to correlate the employment outcomes from 2009, 2010, and 2007, 8, and 9, actually their closure rates vary from year to year. So the correlation on employment outcome is very low. So there's certain things that the state do that may force them, for some reason, some year they want to close more cases, some years they don't push people to close more cases, okay? So there are political issues involved. So interesting, employment rate from year to year among state agencies are not that consistent. However, quality of employment is consistent. States that can produce higher quality employment in 2007, they will produce higher quality of employment in 2008, and they will produce higher quality of employment in 2009. That means there's some states doing better job in quality employment outcomes. So we then decided to use individual characteristics, work rehab services, and environmental factors to see if it will predict employment quality and look at whether we can explain about state differences, okay? And I need to get done very quickly, so I'll just let you know what happened, okay? So basically, the first step I want to know will be, let's take a hypothetical client, a hypothetical consumer. If I put that hypothetical consumer in state agency A, what happened? If I put that hypothetical consumer in state agency B, what happened? If I take that hypothetical consumer in state agency C, what happened? Just, that means, is there any automatic difference just by being in what state agency or in what state, okay? And what we find that will be indeed, okay, this state agency account for about 7% of the variations. So just by being in one state, that automatically you may have a higher chance of being okay, or better quality outcome, or you will have lower quality outcome, okay? We then put personal factor into our regression analysis, and we find that actually personal factors will decrease within state variations. So that means, in any given state, your personal characteristics account for that variation in outcome in any given state, okay? For example, if you are white, you actually do better, okay? If you have sensory disability, you do better than people with, say, psychiatric disabilities, okay? In terms of quality of employment outcomes, okay? Also, they also decrease the between-state differences in terms of personal characteristics. So indicating that the composition of consumers with successful outcome among all states vary by their personal characteristics and then strongly influence their quality of employment outcomes. Okay. Now, disability characteristics also significantly influence outcome. We kind of know that. For example, if you receive SSI, SSDI, the quality of your employment outcomes is lower. Although you can be placed, but you may make less money, you may work less hours per week, you may earn less per hour, and you may not receive employer-based health insurance. And so those are the things that we know. And then rehab consumers were more likely to find good jobs with benefits if they have higher education. So at closure, if they have high educational attainment, they make more money. So that's common sense, but at least we have data to tell you that. And then people who have a sensory impairments, they're closest, they make more money than physical disability, than mental health impairments, and then people with cognitive impairments. And African Americans and Asians have lower employment quality compared to white, okay? Then we add services to it, and service actually also decrease the within state variations by 5%, but did not change the between state variations. So the good news is this, I think rehab counselors are pretty well trained to customize their services based on disability type, okay, and other personal characteristics. And therefore, work rehab services are relatively similar, doesn't matter what state you go to. Counselors kind of know what kind of services that you need, okay? And so that did not decrease between state variations. All 6 services are significant predictors, but most importantly will be supported employment and educational interventions predict qualitative employment outcomes. Supported employment actually predict lower qualitative employment outcomes. So, but this is not apple and comparisons, because there's certain characteristics that lead to a person to receive supported employment, okay? And there are certain characteristics that lead certain disability to receive post-secondary education, at least currently, okay? For example, if you have a physical disabilities or sensory disabilities, counselors are more willing to provide post-secondary education for you because they think the return on investment is higher, okay? And so, so those are things that we find out in terms of services, and services significantly decrease the effect size of disability and Social Security benefits, okay? So those are the main things that I find, and I need to leave some time for Dave. There's one more study that we did. We actually found, because of the WIOA, we looked at a whole bunch of people between 16 to 25. Let me see if this, no, we take the prime working age group, and we actually find that if you provide them with post-secondary education, they actually have better employment outcomes. So, so those are the things that we've been playing using just a simple but large data set, and it allows us to find things that actually have some implication for stable career counselors. So I'm going to give this back to Dave.
Thanks, Phong. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here again, and I'm definitely, I guess if Phong's intergalactical, so is Paul Waitman, and that makes me just very pedestrian. So you're getting a pedestrian view here. And on a serious note, what I'm looking to do here is this. So I was looking at what I was asked to do, and a couple things struck my mind is, I'm not big into large data set analytics from my past research. I've done it, been involved with it, and appreciate it. But I thought what would probably be really important is to kind of contextualize what is going on with large data and how do we use it and what do maybe we need to do. And so I looked at it in terms of, trying to ground us a little bit on maybe where we are, where we need to go, and what things can we do. And that's the wrong button, okay? So I was looking at this and said, okay, let's take a look at what we have for large data. And I'm in the Department of Health or Applied Health Sciences, so I work with some epidemiologists and have gotten fluent enough to be knowledgeable about that to some extent about what they're looking at. And I think when I look at large data, when we talk about large data and what we need to do with large data, I think there's kind of 3 things that we need to keep in mind. As a context, healthcare is definitely gravitating towards large data analysis as a focus. And we have large data, we have data science, which is, I'll explain in a minute, and data analytics. And I think it's important just to understand those terms and how people are using them in the healthcare industry and health research. But 3 primary areas of focus, and I think this is really important because we talked a lot about, and it's been talked a lot about the 9/11 data set, but certainly when we look at large data, there's issues related to management of large data and development of large data. I mean, we're talking about 9/11 as being our data set that we use a lot, and that's one, and Phong talked about some things as far as analyzing that and potentially even managing some of that. But we also need to be talking a little bit too about development of large data. Where are we missing large data? I'm going to show you some data sets at the end that are commonly used in health, but we also need to be a little bit more proactive as researchers in the field of helping cultivate and provide information about where we would like to see some large data developed. And that is something that we're probably a little bit behind on compared to other areas in health. So like the American Community Survey, we'll see some the N. Haynes data, and some CCSS is a data set that I've done some stuff with in cancer. That's a really interesting project. I'll talk about that in a minute. You know, we are not maybe being as active in not just managing, but looking to develop large data as well. Phong talked about methods for systematic manipulation of data sets, the analysis of that. And those are the things when we talk about propensity score, different things along those lines, we want to come in and talk about that, and we need to look at that, and we need as a field continue to evolve in that. But then also, when we get down to the knowledge translation piece here, how do we take this valuable information that we get from the large data set and translate it to the problems that we're dealing with and trying to put that into a context to deal with it? So these are 3 things that I think are questions that we need to be asking ourselves, and or I guess a context of what's going on, which kind of leads us to a couple questions. But just here real quickly, large data is big, sufficient volume. Data science is a multidisciplinary field that we're part of, because Phong just talked about it, was how do we analyze this data? So a lot of different methodologists getting involved with that. And then the data analytics are really consisting of 2 things. I think this is very important, because we tend to think of data analytics as thinking of just analyzing the data, which is step 1. But step 2 is part of it as well, and that is drawing conclusions based on the analysis. How do we take this data that we get and draw meaningful conclusions and apply it? So it's not just what does that propensity score mean, and how does it apply to what we do, and what does it tell us, and how does it inform us? So that is part of it as well. So to me, there's 2 as I looked on this and preparing for this, I was thinking about, okay, so what are the things that we need to know? And I think there's 2 major questions. So I started off by saying, okay, so this opening statement I think is really important here, is when strategizing how to create and sustain large data-centric systems, we have to, again, probably be more responsible for creation. We need to start thinking about not just 9/11, but how are we going to work, and how are we going to advocate? How are we going to talk about the development of larger data sets that potentially meet our needs? And who are and not just our needs of people with disabilities. So we heard from Professor Wayman this morning talking about evidence-based practice, needing to get more evidence. How did we generate more evidence? What do we need to do? And we heard from Phong Chan here about how large data sets can help us do some of that. But we also then need to say, well, what are those other questions, and what large data might we need to start to generate to do that? So the first question is good going back to history of science class that I took here at Wisconsin, is how do we ensure that we're asking the right questions? And I think that's the really key part to start out about this, is what are the questions that we need to have asked, and what are the questions we want to ask? And when we talk to people and we work in the field and we get our hands dirty working with individuals, what are the questions that we need to have asked? Instead of the data set driving us to the questions, which is a very reactive approach to it, how do we become more proactive to develop the data, cultivate the data, for us to become more proactive in generating the questions that are relevant to us and people with disabilities? I think that's a really critical piece, that we tend to take a very passive approach to large data versus a more proactive approach to what do we need to do to develop data. So with that, we have to identify problems and an application of theory. And I'm just going to kind of show you something that I've toyed around with. this is a model that I developed that just kind of helps me think about employment, and this isn't really, I don't want you to look at it in a lot of detail, but this to me is kind of the framework that we need to start looking at from large data, is saying, okay, how does a model like this potentially, the ICF is a model, this is another model, this is a subset of the ICF in a way we looks at participation and employment. How does this type of model guide us in potentially developing large data? How does it potentially provide us a framework for guiding questions that we want to have answered and generating larger data based on that? So this is just one example, obviously, of the type of model that can help us as we look at problem identification and application of theory. I think two things that, in my mind, and I'm sure somebody will correct me if I'm wrong on this, as I always get emails on different things here. Framework versus theory. To me, a framework provides us a nice structure to allow us to identify where the domains are that we want to address. Theories, to me, are embedded in frameworks that say, this is how the variables relate to each other. So I think that's very important. We want a framework to look at what are the benchmarks or the beacons that we want to talk about, and then we can analyze theory within that framework. And I think that really speaks to the complementary nature of larger data set analysis within more small data set analysis, where we can start to look at theory application to specific interactions that evolve out of a framework. So I think that to me is something that I need to be reminded of. And then obviously this question that we got now a big buzz in the industry here going on knowledge translation. You know, how do we translate the data generated to produce valuable, meaningful, adaptable interventions and policies that address important questions? But we have to know the questions before we can talk about knowledge translation. So knowledge translation is obviously important, and one of the frameworks I'm interested in knowledge translation in, or I think has a lot of relevance to knowledge translation, is the RSA model that comes from public health, where evidence-based practice talks a lot about this, reach and efficacy, not as much about how can this be adopted, how can it be implemented, and how can it be maintained. So we'll get to that in a minute. So here is a framework that I'm borrowing from a gentleman from Ohio State, and I should have cited him, I apologize for that, of how he's conceptualizing managing large data, and I think it has some merit for us, and I think there's a couple problems with it as well. So he has this nice fancy term for upstream analytic consumers, basically researchers, professors, think tanks who are generating information, thinking about these questions, generating these driving questions. And at the bottom of this, you have downstream consumers are basically practitioners. So we should start to be thinking, okay, I've heard about this through knowledge translation. And that drives to what he calls actionable knowledge. And if we look at this diagram, the inputs into knowledge or actionable knowledge are the researchers. But when we talk about large data, it's understanding the data source, having a good comprehensive knowledge about the data source that's being used, and then also understanding the computational tools or the analytics that can be used to extract the data from the large data set. Okay, that produces actionable knowledge, supposedly, being pushed downstream to the consumers who then use it for interventions and outcomes. Now, this bidirectional arrow here talks about the integration of the outcomes to the questions, which the part that I think is really missing is this bidirectional hero giving feedback to the upstream people. But anyways, I don't want to get bogged down on this model, but I think what it's speaking to the fact is here that we need to think about what becomes actionable knowledge has many different components that feed into it. So when we talk about large data, it's not only answering the right questions, but then it is understanding the data source, or I would suggest to you, we may not have adequate data sources developed yet. We need to create adequate data sources or continue to create data sources, and then understanding the computational tools, which I think is a lot of what Fong spent his time on, talking about the different tools and strategies used to extract very valuable and rich data. This is basically what I just told you, so for the sake of time, I'm not going to spend on that. Talk a little bit about knowledge translation in this piece here. So our goal as we're being reminded and continue to focus on, is developing actionable knowledge or knowledge that can be used and applied to the field to answer these important questions. So when we look at this, our good fancy term is contextualize the data. That to me is kind of the 10-cent academic word now. Contextualize, context, put everything in context, contextualize, good thing to say. It's basically, how does this data sit within the environment that we're trying to work? And I think that's what we get accused of a lot as academics, is that, well, this data doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't really, it's not useful. It doesn't apply to me. I don't understand how it applies to me. And I think that's really something that we need to address and talk about. We are trying to do it through KT and knowledge translation, but I think we also need to be looking at our systems of education and modeling, our development as a field on how we use that. Second thing is, do we deliver knowledge in an appropriate format to the appropriate individuals at the appropriate time? That's another very important thing when we look at this. And then obviously, can this data support or influence decision-making and other data-driven outcomes? We are in the day and the age, obviously have been for a while, of evidence-based practice, of having support and scientific evidence and the need for that. But as you'll see in a minute when we go to the REAIM model and the REAIM framework, I think it's more than just evidence. Does this evidence have application? Can we implement it and can we maintain it? Okay? Because, for example, I can put myself in a gym with a personal trainer with limited food, and all I'm going to do is work out, eat healthy, exercise, do all that. I'm going to lose weight. Now, I go into the real world, okay, where I have a busy schedule and I don't work out as much. Refrigerator tends to be a little bit overstocked. Tend to relax a little bit on the weekend. And then, weight goes up. Well, that's real life. But how do we talk about it in terms of contextualizing that intervention within a real life setting, and how do we take that large data to help us inform that policy? So how do we do that? And how do we do that? I think this is kind of the meat and potatoes of my presentation, is this. It is a bidirectional buy-in from both ends of the spectrum, okay? As researchers, yeah, do we produce some meaningless stuff that just goes into journals to pad our academic resume? Sure. But also as practitioners, it can't just be, well, research isn't relevant, therefore I don't need to know it. Okay? That's kind of what's going on in Congress right now, and we see where that ends up. Okay? We need to have bidirectional buy-in. So what happens is, when we have meaningful adaptation and utilization of knowledge, it is the relationships between the components, both the low-end users and the high-end users, or the upper end and the lower end, are buying in and have a strong relationship. That's critical. That's why a conference like this is very important, okay? Understand roles, understand clearly what's going on, and I think, again, where I think really it's important we talk about this is data set cultivation. How do we cultivate and develop data sets that are going to be meaningful for us to answer the questions that we need? And there could be no clearer example of where we need mutual buy-in is to do that. Questions must be informed and motivated by a unifying framework or theory, okay? And again, frameworks, I prefer more framework as milestones, as beacons, as benchmarks to kind of think about what we need to be touching on in big components. I think sometimes we get way bogged down in, let's look at like social cognitive. How many social cognitive theories do we have? Self-efficacy, hope, locus of control. You can go on. And the fundamental connection of those, as you can say, is that people who feel like they have some confidence and control over their environments and things are going to do better. Okay? And I'm not saying that those aren't important theories, but sometimes we focus more on the micro components of theories to guide our research, which is very important. But when we look at it from a 10,000-foot level, it's not, is it self-efficacy or locus of control, it's more social cognitive variables. And then I think this framework of the REAIM framework has some very strong merit as far as how we look at a general research paradigm and protocol is our research paradigm and our research approach needs to accomplish several things. We need to certainly focus on this end of the equation here, reach and efficacy. Who are the target populations and how efficacious is this? Okay, very critical. But that's not necessarily the end game. Because again, using my poor example of myself with exercise, okay, I can do very well in a controlled environment and drop 20 pounds, get stronger, feel better and lean, but then I go out into the real world and it falls apart. Okay? So we can control in our studies, because we control everything, because our review agencies, NIDLR, NIH, all these, they want to control. You know, how are you control? We get stressed so much on controlling these variables because we want to lock in on what are the efficacious elements of this intervention. Very important to do. But then we have to, my 10-cent word, contextualize the findings. And that's where we get into how does this get adopted. So if you need to have one employment specialist for one person, is that going to be feasible in an environment that's cash-strapped, searching for every dime that it has, and is overburdened as far as its services? Nurses have done a great job of that. If people are familiar with the nurse study. So nurses were typically got to the point where they were servicing like 10 people, 12 people on the floor. So one nurse was responsible for 12 people. The Nursing Association did a study that said the optimal ratio is 1 to 6. And when you get above 6, people start dying at a proportional rate. Right? Very strong. Within a year, back down to 1 to 6 on the nurse floor. Nursing's a great opportunity, right? That's very strong, okay? So yeah, getting down to, you know, can these things be adapted? What is the impact, or can it be implemented, I should say, over a period of time? How feasible is it to be implemented, and can it be maintained? And here's kind of a slide that some of you may have seen from a previous presentation I did, where we look at these different elements of the REAIM model and how it feeds together. But my final thought on this before I get to the data sets, and there's one particular data set I want to talk about in a little bit of detail here with my 2 minutes left, is I would suggest that we take a broader view of our large data and a more proactive view of large data. 9/11 is good, it's rich, it's there. But what other data sources do we need to develop, and what do we need to start to advocate for as a field about what do we want to develop and how do we cultivate that? And I'll show you one in a minute that's been done in the cancer area that I think is a really good model for us. All right, overall goals is developing an environment that fosters this thought. Okay, we maybe need to change our view as educators and researchers of not just talking about efficacy, controlling every variable. Those are very important, and we need to stress that still. But we also need to take a step back to how does this relate to being adapted, implemented, and maintained, and study those variables just as intensely as we do efficacy. Developing methods that empower researchers and stakeholders to work together, okay? And creating an environment that is directed at this. So getting funding and advocating for funding and advocating for the allocation of resources to develop these types of things. Okay, so with my 30 seconds that's left, I want to talk to you about one data set that I think is really a very, very interesting concept that developed out of somebody's dissertation about 25 years ago at the University of Minnesota, where the dissertation was, we want to collect continuous data on cancer survivors starting at a certain age. And we're going to follow up with these people. We're going to do a longitudinal follow-up with these people every year. And they've been doing it now, so people who've been in there, they've been following people for 25, 30 years. And this is called the Childhood Cancer Survivor Studies. So these are people who were diagnosed with cancer as children, and they're followed along. And St. Jude has this data set right now, and Fong and I have published some articles based on that. But what they do is they have a core element of instruments and questions that they follow along with the cancer survivors in this cohort. And they follow along and answer that. Now what they also do, which we were part of, is that they allow for people to put proposals in to that data set to answer specific questions of interest. Ours was career development and employment. So every year they're surveying these people, asking them how are they doing, what's going on with this, what's your functional limitations, have you had a reoccurrence, when was the last time you got treatment, so they kind of follow along that. But then they embed within that a subset every year of questions that when the people get called, they get asked these questions. It's a very novel, very, I think, robust way to continuously collect data, but be able to interject within a model where they can interject to look at specific questions of interest or particular variables of interest. So if you get a chance and you're interested in it, if you go to that website right here, you'll be able to look at what they do there and how they do it. It's very, very impressive. A couple other ones that I've become familiar with at the University of Illinois that I think are some rich ones is the N. Haynes, where it looks at adults and children. It's looking at nutrition and health, pretty comprehensive health survey. The National Health Interview Survey by the CDC. The SEER data is one that a lot of cancer researchers use a lot of, so that becomes one. But again, in closing, I think a couple things that I would say are takeaways from hopefully what you get from me is this. One, I would encourage us to think broader and more proactive on large data, less reactionary. What do we want? What do we need as a field to be getting data on, and how do we construct that? And we need to work with RSA, NIDLR, and other funding agencies for us to actively push beyond the 9/11 data set to look at this data. Two, we need to continue to foster an environment of collaboration that has started in KT and the push for KT, but gets beyond just knowledge translation, but to truly a collaborative research model that involves practitioners in the field and state agencies. Our nuts and bolts are there. It's now a matter of connecting the pieces and practitioners embracing research and embracing becoming involved in research, and us as educators embracing practitioners becoming involved in the research process and as active team members within the research process. So I think that's a good place for me to stop, and I've gone 5 minutes over, Tim.
Is this still on? All right, a couple of quick housekeeping things, just to let you know, this is the point where we break into our concurrent sessions of the agenda. To access the rooms for the other sessions, one will be held in here, but the rest are held all on the L1 floor, which is the floor at the top of the stairs. I did have a couple of questions about the CRC forms. We do have people standing in the back. I'll be in the front during the break to sign those forms. Please make sure to get those signed, because it's the only way we can offer credit. Questions about, there's kind of two check boxes. There's a CRC and then there's a CEU that has a statement next to it that there is a $20 fee with that. Your CRC credits are included as part of this event, so there is no charge for receiving credit for CRC. If you are, however, looking to apply this conference for CEU credits for other organizations, state licensure, et cetera, then you would need to go ahead and check that other box and then put the $20 fee in when you send that form in. Last kind of housekeeping thing, since we're not all going to be in this room together necessarily for the rest of the day until we get to the closing remarks at 4:15. Lunch is on your own from 12:30 to 2. We did give you an extended lunch from the standpoint of, although there is a great coffee shop up on the first floor, which is great to go to, Madison, for many of you knows, has a lot to offer in the way of food. I highly recommend going down State Street. I'm going to give you a little extra time for that travel time. They'll love to have you. Since the students are all gone, they're looking for people to show up. So please consider hitting any number of the restaurants going down the area there. I believe you do have a City of Madison guide that actually tells you what some of the restaurants are. And hope you're all having a wonderful day so far and looking forward to the rest of the day. Thank you.